Dive Podcast. Straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller. We cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed.
Okay, so today is May 15th, 2025, and our focus for this deep dive is very much on the upcoming negotiations between Ukraine and Russia.
That's right, the one set to happen in Istanbul.
Exactly. We're going to try and unpack the key developments, what the stated objectives are for these talks.
And it's all happening right now, basically, today and tomorrow, May 15th and 16th.
Right. So let's start with Ukraine. We heard President Zelensky, speaking from Ankara actually, announce that a Ukrainian delegation is heading to Istanbul.
Yes, and he framed it quite specifically, didn't he?
He did. He said it was done out of respect for the U.S. president, the Turkish delegation, and President Erdogan himself.
Out of respect. It's, diplomatic language, of course, but it does sort of highlight the international context here.
Yeah, it feels like it emphasizes the external actors involved, perhaps.
It could, yeah. A way to signal that this isn't happening in a vacuum. And, well, the main goal, as they stated, is pretty clear.
Achieving a ceasefire.
Exactly. That's been the consistent line from Kyiv.
And Zelensky was also clear, this isn't the main negotiating team, not the full lineup.
Right, it's a partial delegation, led by Defense Minister Rustam Umarov.
Which is significant. But notable absences, too, like the head of the SBU, Maluk, and the chief of general staff, Ainatov, they're not part of this group.
Correct. And Zelensky himself isn't going either.
So the defense minister is leading. What does that specific composition, or maybe the omissions, suggest about the initial focus?
Well, having the defense minister there obviously points to the security aspects, the ceasefire mechanics, perhaps.
Makes sense.
The absence of the others, like the SBU chief, might mean these first talks are really zeroing in on just stopping the fighting, rather than those broader, really complex security guarantees or intelligence issues.
So potentially a narrower scope, at least to start?
Could be, yeah. A deliberate focus for this initial face-to-face meeting.
Zelensky also mentioned talks might stretch into May 16th, and maybe even meetings involving a U.S. delegation. And we did get the official approval of the delegation list. It includes the first deputy foreign minister, Kyslytsya, and also the deputy chairman of the SBU, Poklad.
Okay, so there is SBU representation, just not the really top person, and a senior diplomat too.
Right. So how does that combination read? Diplomacy and security, but maybe not the absolute highest level on the security intelligence side?
It suggests a kind of coordinated approach, I think. Yeah. You've got the diplomatic angle covered with Kyslytsya, the immediate ceasefire focus perhaps with Umarov, and the SBU deputy keeping an eye on internal security aspects. Seems balanced for maybe preliminary talks.
Okay, let's switch over to Russia. Their delegation arrived in Istanbul today, May 15th, led by Vladimir Medinsky.
Yes, the presidential aide.
And the rest of the team, Deputy Foreign Minister Galusin, Military Intelligence Chief Kostyukov, Deputy Defense Minister Fomin. Well, it's the exact same group as the Istanbul talks back in March 2022.
That is striking. The same lineup after all this time.
What does that consistency suggest? Is it strategic continuity or, could it signal something else?
Well, on one hand, it means they have that institutional memory. They know the drill from last time.
Sure.
But, yeah, it could also be seen as maybe a sign of inflexibility. Or that they're sticking rigidly to the positions they held back then. It's notable either way.
Medinsky himself stated their ultimate goal is peace and addressing the, quote, root causes of the conflict.
Root causes, that phrase is always significant coming from Moscow.
It is. He also said they're ready for compromises and have all competencies needed for the talks.
Standard phrasing, perhaps, but the root causes part likely refers to their long-standing grievances, NATO, geopolitical security, that kind of thing.
So signaling they want more than just a pause in fighting. They want a comprehensive deal addressing their core issues.
That seems to be the implication, yes.
Now, the timeline shifted a bit. The Russian Foreign Ministry initially suggested talks would start this afternoon, May 15th, maybe, at Turkey's request. But now reports from TASS and Kommersant citing sources suggest things will likely kick off tomorrow, May 16th.
Okay, a select delay. These things happen. Logistics, maybe some last-minute coordination.
Could be. It was also mentioned the Russian delegation was waiting for the Ukrainians and wouldn't be based at the Dolmabahce Palace this time, but somewhere else.
Right, managing the optics and the setup carefully.
And we heard from a Ukrainian presidential advisor, Dmytro Litvin, confirming their delegation gets into Istanbul later this evening, the 15th.
So everyone should be in place by tonight, ready for tomorrow.
And it's worth just pausing to remember, this is the first time they've met face-to-face in 3 years.
Wow, 3 years. Since March 29, 2022, also in Istanbul.
Everything after that was video calls, which then stopped around mid-May 2022.
So just getting back into the same room physically is actually a pretty big step in itself, isn't it?
It feels like it. It allows for a different dynamic, potentially.
Absolutely. Even if expectations are cautious, the format itself is significant after such a long break.
And circling back to Ukraine's key objective, Zelensky has just been hammering this home. Issue number 1 is the ceasefire.
Utter clarity on that point. Stop the fighting first.
For Ukraine, that's the absolute priority. Stop the losses. Stop the destruction.
It's the essential prerequisite from their perspective for any meaningful progress on the harder, longer-term issues. Makes complete sense.
Now let's bring the U.S. perspective into this. After talks with President Erdogan, Zelensky made a comment that raised some eyebrows.
Oh, what was that?
He suggested that the U.S. president, in his approach to resolving the conflict, had put more pressure on Ukraine than on Russia.
That's quite pointed.
It is. What might that signal? A divergence in how Kyiv and Washington see the path forward right now.
It could reflect that, yes.
Yeah.
Perhaps a Ukrainian feeling that they're being pushed towards concessions more forcefully or maybe differently than Russia is.
Maybe different strategic calculations at play.
Possibly. The U.S. has its own global considerations, balancing support for Ukraine with wider risks. It points to those potential underlying tensions, even between close partners.
Zelensky also doubled down on the idea that if Russia blocks a peaceful resolution, the U.S. needs to ramp up sanctions.
Right, the or-else part of the equation.
And we know the U.S. president has floated the idea of new sanctions before, depending on how Moscow engages.
So that threat of more economic pain is definitely hanging over these Istanbul talks as part of the leverage.
And related to that, there was that bill introduced recently by Senators Graham and Blumenthal.
Ah, yes, proposing quite severe sanctions, primary and secondary, if a peace deal isn't reached soon.
Including potentially huge tariffs, like 500% on imports from countries still buying Russian oil, gas, uranium.
Really significant potential measures. And the U.S. president indicated earlier in May he might actually sign such a bill.
So it shows there's serious thought in the U.S. about escalating economic pressure significantly if these talks don't yield results.
It definitely signals a strong backing, at least from parts of the U.S. political system, for using economic tools quite forcefully to push for a resolution.
Okay, so wrapping up our deep dive for today, May 15th, 2025. We've looked ahead to the negotiations starting tomorrow, May 16th, in Istanbul.
And the absolute key focus, certainly from the Ukrainian side, as stated by President Zelensky, is achieving that ceasefire.
Yeah, that's priority 1. We've also touched on the delegations Umarov leading for Ukraine, Medinsky for Russia with his familiar team.
Both sides publicly talking about peace, about addressing root causes, although, what those causes are is likely viewed very differently.
Absolutely. It's a complex picture, and certainly the return to face-to-face talks after 3 years is something the world will be watching very closely.
Indeed. To see if this direct engagement can break the stalemate, even just incrementally.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.